Okay, so let's get started. This is modules 8, 9, and 10 from your textbook. Module 8 is on brain states and consciousness. Just a few things I want to hit on this one. First of all, consciousness is just our awareness of ourselves and our surroundings. And your consciousness changes from moment to moment. What you're paying attention to is basically how awake you are, is basically a lot of what your consciousness entails. People who have ADHD have trouble focusing their consciousness, so this is a pretty common thing for people who have, what's called ADD, which actually technically isn't a diagnosis, but ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a pretty common thing for people to experience symptoms of, at least occasionally. And our consciousness is kind of designed for us to pay attention to one thing at a time. We're not particularly good at multitasking, and our consciousness is limited by our awareness and our ability to pay attention to things. And one of the things with ADHD in particular, just want to quickly touch on this. When I was talking about the brain stuff last week, your brain kind of wakes up from the back to the front. Your temporal lobes, your ability to hear things, always online, always active. But when you're asleep, obviously your eyes are closed, hopefully, and you don't see anything. But as soon as you wake up, you open your eyes, presuming your vision is relatively normal, you can see. You might have a little sleep goo in your eyes. You have to wipe that out, things like that. But you can see pretty normally. You might have to get your glasses, put your contacts in, or whatever to be able to see clearly. But your vision comes online quickly. The next thing wakes up from the back to the front is the parietal lobe, which is kind of the center of your coordination. A lot of your body controls, your voluntary muscle movement, that kind of thing, are all controlled partly in the parietal lobe of the brain. And that takes a little longer. Most of us, when we first wake up, are a little klutzy when we first get up out of bed. And it may take, 5-10 minutes before you kind of wake up all the way and don't, risk shoving your toothpaste across your face, which I totally did last week. And then that's online. Everything's good. The frontal lobe of your brain, the part right behind your forehead, takes the longest to come online. And for people who have ADHD, it doesn't completely come online. It's still sitting there going chug, 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 thinking about, opening up that web browser. And that's one of the reasons why medication for ADHD is stimulant medication. The most commonly prescribed drugs for treatment of ADHD are amphetamines. Speed, yeah, which seems counterintuitive because you're talking about giving a drug to people who are already hyperactive that is a stimulant. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't understand how ADHD works. The frontal lobe of your brain is what is in charge of your higher order thinking, your judgment, your impulse control. And for those individuals, they actually need a little extra boost in order for their frontal lobes to wake up completely and engage in that self-control, in that judgment, in that planning ability. So for them, it's not making them more hyper. It's not making them more out of control. It's actually helping them engage the self-control that they have. It's helping them access the self-control that they have. Caffeine also works. Not as well. It's not as strong as speed, but it also can help a lot of those individuals. So whenever I had clients, parents of kids that I was working with that had ADHD issues, I always, always, always recommended try caffeine first. Heck of a lot less side effects in a can of Mountain Dew than in a bottle of Ritalin. So there's that. Blind sight is a phenomenon where you respond to a visual stimulus without actually consciously experiencing it. So, here's a scenario. You're sitting on the quad, out under the flagpoles there by Starbucks, and somebody's throwing a frisbee around on the quad, and all of a sudden your arm goes up like this to block a frisbee. and you didn't even realize that you saw anything, but your peripheral vision was still processing what was going on around you. We have dual processing abilities where we have both conscious and subconscious processing going on. And this is one of the things that we had, this blind sight, to be able to actually see things that we're not consciously aware of. We also have selective attention, which is also called the cocktail party effect. The focus of our conscious awareness can move from thing to thing very quickly in a short period of time. And it's really necessary for us to be able to filter all the extraneous stuff, all the extra noises we have in the environment, all the extra just things that are happening around us. And we need to be able to pay attention to the thing that we're doing. So, say you go to a party, you're meeting a friend there, it's a place you've never been before, you feel kind of awkward, and then you hear your name, and all the other noise, all the other music, all the other sounds that are going on are suddenly gone, and you hear your name, and you focus on that exclusively, trying to figure out where that sound came from. Where's my friend? Where's my friend? Scoping the room. So that's how that selective attention can work for us. We also have what's called change blindness or inattentional blindness. They're very related. They're separate things technically, but they're very close to the same thing. It's just failing to notice things in the environment. So change blindness is just not noticing stuff. There's a classic experiment that was done in psychology years ago. Had a group of 4 people, subjects in this experiment, playing Foursquare, the game Foursquare, where you're bouncing a ball back and forth to people. And the experimenters had these people bouncing this ball back and forth. And they also had them counting how many times the ball bounced. And these 4 people are engaged in this activity for, 5-10 minutes, what have you. And they have a cohort in the experiment fully decked out in a gorilla costume, walking right by these people, stopping, doing the chest beating thing that gorillas do, and most people didn't even notice. That's a pretty significant thing to not notice, but people were so focused physically on both throwing and catching the ball, and mentally by both counting and keeping track of the number of times that the ball bounced, that they didn't notice this very significant thing happening in the background of their activity. There's an episode of a TV show called Brain Games on National Geographic, which is now on the Disney Plus channel, I believe, if you have access to that. That showed a really good example of change blindness. It was people at a casino in Las Vegas, and they were given paperwork to fill out to basically get another prize of some sort. And the people were so concentrated on filling out that paperwork behind a counter. A person, hands them the paperwork and then ducks down behind the counter, and another person pops up. Most people didn't notice. They changed the gender of the person. People didn't notice. They changed the race of the person, and people still didn't notice. So, are we aware of our environment? Not that much. So, one of the things that's very common in a lot of people is this self-consciousness, because you feel like people are looking at you and paying attention to you. It's called the spotlight effect. We don't pay attention. We don't notice all sorts of things that are happening right in front of us. And it's even less likely that we will notice things going around in front of us now. You're waiting in line at the bank, at the grocery store, whatever. And what's the first thing most of us do now? We whip out our toys, right? So we're paying even less attention than people were, 25 years ago, when these were not the ubiquitous things that they are now. So it's certainly an understandable thing that we've all gotten kind of used to, these distractions. So the change blindness is even more common than it used to be. So there's that. Module 9 is on sleep and dreams. So we have biological rhythms that kind of are periodic physiological fluctuations in our energy levels and our alertness levels. And you have annual cycles that are more prevalent in certain types of animals that control like migratory patterns and hibernation cycles. Human beings don't tend to have the annual cycles in such a direct way, but there is a psychological disorder called seasonal affective disorder that's part of major depressive disorder that is largely due to changes in seasons that happen during the wintertime, especially in places where there's very little sunlight. Places like in Scandinavia, Alaska, Canada, kind of more places where there's a lot of snow, places where the days get very, very short, and a fair chunk of Europe even has sections of the wintertime where they only get maybe 4 or 5 hours of sun a day if there is sun available, because these are also places where there's a lot of rain, a lot of snow potentially. So there are a lot of things like that that can also influence our feelings and our cycles. But again, that is not a universal thing the way you see like migration with certain species of birds and such. Circadian rhythms are roughly 24-hour cycles of alertness that we have as human beings. The so-called biological clock that kind of controls our wakefulness, our sleepiness, how alert we feel. And there are the so-called larks, who are the morning people, and there are the so-called night owls that are, well, obviously the night people that have more comfortable alertness in the evening and early morning hours. And then there are people who definitely feel better in the early morning. There is no particular good or bad about either one of those things, except in that people who are morning people, the world accommodates that more easily than people who are night owls. The world, it does not accommodate someone who keeps the hours of 4 in the morning until noon for their sleep nearly as well as someone who goes to bed at 8 and wakes up at 4 in the morning, or goes to bed at 9 and wakes up at 5 in the morning. Most businesses, places where you can do things and jobs are more likely to have that kind of, 7 to 7 kind of opening hours, or that 8 to 5 kind of business lifestyle. There are just lots and lots and lots of jobs out there that require you to basically be at work from 8 to 5. And if you're someone who doesn't feel good when you have to get up at 7:30, 6:30 in the morning, that may be, a difficult thing for you. But these circadian rhythms are just basically these 24-hour cycles of alertness. Ultradian rhythms are basically a roughly 90-minute cycle of alertness within those circadian rhythms. And that's basically the amount of time that you have. Generally, there is a bit of a range here, but basically the amount of time you have in a full sleep cycle when you're asleep, and when you're awake, it's a full cycle of having, a not a gigantic difference in your attention, but once you get past an hour and a half of sustained attention, it gets difficult. That's why most movies are about an hour and a half long. When you slog through, there are not a whole lot of movies that I can think of that were 3 hours long that didn't feel like they were long. There are a few, but certainly not all that many. Most of the time, there's a reason that these movies are, about an hour and a half, because that's about how long we can manage to pay attention to something. Children's movies are generally shorter than that. The average time frame for a children's movie is 75 minutes-ish, so about an hour and 15 minutes. And even that, depending on the age of the child, is stretching it a bit. So all of these things affect us. Sleep, of course, is a temporary state of unconsciousness that's easily reversible. That's a very important aspect of sleep. It's periodic, it's natural, and it's necessary for us to function. Now, there's all kinds of sleep patterns that people have. How much sleep do you need? The typical rule of thumb is we should be sleeping 8 hours every night. It depends. There are people who do just fine on 6 hours of sleep. There are people who need 9 hours of sleep. When you're a kid, you need more than that. As you get older, you tend to need a little less sleep. But we definitely have individual differences within reason. It is very unusual for someone to not need at least 5 hours of sleep to be able to function pretty normally. And REM sleep is a big part of that. REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, is when you're dreaming. And dreams are necessary. You may not think that dreams are necessary, and you may not remember having dreams, but they are absolutely a part of your sleep experience that helps you recharge your brain and your body. And the whole dream interpretation, Freud put lots and lots and lots of work into interpreting dreams with manifest content and latent content, which is basically the storyline of the dream, and then what it actually means. It was usually something sexual. But we don't exactly know what dreams are for, what purpose they serve, but most of the time it's very tied to whatever you were doing that day. Like if you watch a marathon of Walking Dead right before you go to sleep, guess what you're going to be dreaming about? Zombies. So again, it's a good thing to think in terms of that. If you have trouble sleeping, or if you have nightmares, make sure that you're not watching something like that before you go to sleep, because it's going to make almost certain that you're going to have bad dreams. Melatonin is a sleep-inducing neurotransmitter that is secreted by the pineal glands in our brains, and it's something that tells us it's time to go to sleep. Melatonin is released when it gets dark. Melatonin is not released when you're sitting in bed looking at your phone or playing on your laptop or your tablet. This is one of the things that can interfere with people sleeping, is the light that comes from these devices. One of the things that you can do if you have trouble sleeping, melatonin is one of those things that you can buy as a supplement at the store, and it is relatively inexpensive. One thing, it comes in like 10 milligram tablets and 3 milligram tablets. The 3 milligram is the one to go with. 10 is usually way too much, just FYI. And then it can end up making you feel really groggy, and that's not good. So melatonin is something that people can use to combat insomnia. They can use it to combat, jet lag, things like that. If you've traveled out of, like considerably out of a time zone. Your stages of sleep, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this. You have alpha waves, non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, REM sleep. Okay. You have sleep stages. The main thing I want you to know is the fourth stage of sleep is the deep, deep sleep. The non-REM 3 sleep is that deepest sleep that if you wake up during that time, you're going to feel super groggy. So you don't want to do that. The ideal amount of time for a nap, believe it or not, is about 20 to 30 minutes. If you sleep more than that, you're probably going to get into a deeper sleep and you're going to feel groggy when you wake up. You're going to basically feel like you're kind of stoned, but not in a good way. So if you are going to take a nap, you need to have it be relatively short, like as in 20 to 30 minutes, or go ahead and take, the solid hour and a half to hour 45 minutes to get through one of those entire sleep cycles. So when you wake up, you won't feel groggy. But I honestly, if you're going to take a nap, it's a lot better for you to just take a short nap, because you'll probably feel better. Insomnia is a sleep disorder that most of us are familiar with, because we've all had nights where we couldn't sleep worth a crap. It's just having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. But insomnia is such a huge problem for so many people, because not being able to sleep, not being able to get enough sleep, can just cause a whole litany of problems throughout your day, because you feel tired, your mental alertness is not there, you're physically feeling just exhausted, dragging, lack of energy, all sorts of things. And if insomnia drags on for days and days and days, it can seriously affect your quality of life. Now, occasional insomnia because you're excited about something you're about to do is fine, is normal, not a problem. But if it is a continuous issue, then it becomes something that may need medical intervention. You may need to investigate if you've got some kind of sleep disorder, like narcolepsy. If you're extremely sleepy during the day, narcolepsy is uncontrollable sleep attacks. So that's actually a pretty serious thing, because you could really, have a problem if you fall asleep while you're walking downstairs or driving a car. This is, really dangerous stuff. Sleep apnea is another sleep disorder that's not unusual at all. You may have an older family member that has sleep apnea, and they have to have one of those CPAP machines next to their bed, which stands for continuous positive airway pressure. It's basically it's one of those little masks, kind of looks like what you get at the dentist for that lovely laughing gas that they give you, the nitrous oxide. And it blows air through your nose to keep your airways open. What's happening with sleep apnea is that people are having their airway kind of collapse in on itself, and they're not breathing, and they wake up briefly gasping for air, get the air, fall back asleep, wake up gasping for air. And this can happen dozens of times a night. So obviously you're not getting good rest. So you feel tired during the day. You feel just exhausted all around because you're not sleeping normally at all. And usually you have to have a sleep study, so you have to go somewhere and actually be connected to a bunch of machines that are recording your sleep to get a sleep apnea diagnosis. But it's absolutely worth doing. It's much more common in older, middle-aged to older people, especially men who are carrying a lot of fat around their midsections. There are women who get it too, but it is less common in women for whatever reason than it is in men. But it is something that is very, very treatable, so that's certainly something to keep in mind. Night terrors and nightmares are not the same thing. Nightmares, of course, are just dreams that have really unpleasant content. Night terrors are basically a panic attack in the deepest stage of sleep, where you are absolutely just panicking, and you have no idea that it happened. It's actually not that unusual in children to have this, and they will bolt up out of bed screaming bloody murder, scare the hell out of everyone in the house, give the dog PTSD, just bad stuff. And the child won't even remember it the next morning because it happened in that deepest stage of sleep. A whole lot of parasomnias, that's what these sleep disorders are called. A lot of parasomnias are more common in children, like sleepwalking, sleep talking. One thing about insomnia, just to throw out there, the medications that are commonly prescribed for insomnia, like Lunesta and Ambien, can cause some very unusual behaviors in people's sleep, like sleepwalking, like sleep eating, like doing other things, like having sexual activity when you're sound asleep and having no memory of it in the morning. I remember seeing a video of a guy filming his wife eating an entire stick of butter while she was under the influence of Ambien. Yeah, yuck. I mean, she was eating it like it was a fudgesicle. So, not exactly normal stuff. So if you can find other things, I would definitely recommend someone try melatonin before trying Ambien for sleep. So there are all those things. There are other things, of course, as well, but for the scope of this class, that's enough. Okay, moving into Module 10, which is on drugs and consciousness. Psychoactive drugs are simply any substance that alters mood and or perception. When you're talking about, drugs, you're talking about things that people take recreationally, or things that are prescription medications that are used for legitimate medical purposes. When you're talking about tolerance, you're talking about building up a resistance to a drug's effect. So tolerance is just a diminishing effect with the use of a drug over time, where you have to take more and more to get the same effect. This is a problem because it just increases the likelihood that someone would overdose and take more of something than is safe to take. Withdrawal is when you have discomfort or distress following stopping the use of a drug. When someone has withdrawal effects from a drug, that's an indication that they've got a dependence or an addiction. And withdrawal effects can be relatively mild, like someone is dependent on caffeine and they get the caffeine withdrawal headaches, which are pretty minor, and you mainly just have to drink extra water and maybe, take some Tylenol or something and it goes away. In severe cases, this withdrawal can be really, really bad. If you are withdrawing from opiates, you can actually throw your body into shock and maybe even die. So if you are someone who is addicted to, say, heroin or, Oxycontin or something, or Vicodin, it would probably be a good idea for you to, be in a hospital when you're detoxing from those things, because it can be really, actually dangerous in some cases. And it's certainly unpleasant in virtually all cases if you have a real substance dependence issue. Now, there are two types of substance dependence. You have physical dependence, which you have the withdrawal symptoms where your body's actually, hurting for not having that drug that it's become dependent on. And then you have psychological dependence, where you have a craving for that drug and the usage of it is basically not under your control anymore. You are just compelled to use this drug in order to deal with psychological discomfort as well as the physical discomfort. When you have what's called the drug-centered lifestyle kind of thing, where most of your life's energy is taken up with using the drug, finding the drug, using the drug, finding the drug, buying the drug, those things all have just kind of taken over. So that is definitely when you've got an addiction. Now, we do not diagnose people with addiction. We diagnose people with substance dependence. The Venn diagram of the two overlap a lot, but an addiction is just that compulsive use that the person just doesn't have control over anymore. Although that's, substance dependence is definitely on the way to an addiction issue. But these are all very related things, and none of them are good. So as far as substance dependence issues, the kinds of things that people have substance dependence on, you have depressants, you have stimulants, you have hallucinogens. Hallucinogens not so much. Honestly, people don't generally get a addiction to hallucinogens the way they do with depressants and stimulants. But the depressants, you got four main things I want to talk about. Alcohol, of course, alcohol is widely available, it's legal, it's relatively cheap, depending on especially what kind you're drinking, and it's socially acceptable for a lot of situations for people to have alcohol, and especially if you're of age, if you are old enough for it to be legal where you are. There are places that are dedicated to drinking called bars. There are all sorts of socially acceptable situations in which alcohol consumption is not only acceptable but almost mandatory. And the problems with alcohol mainly have to do with how you respond to it personally, how your body's physiology responds to alcohol. There are people for whom alcohol brings out some really ugly parts of them. There are people who get drunk and they're the I want to kick your ass people, and that's not good. There are people for whom they get drunk and they're the I love you man drunks. They're like, I love you guys. Y'all are the best friends I've ever had. Those people are not generally going to get in a whole lot of trouble. Except those people are also the ones that may well end up in bed with somebody that they would not have slept with otherwise. So that is a potential pitfall for sure. The drunk goggles were kind of a thing. So that is something that people also need to consider as far as how they respond to alcohol. If you are someone who gets super aggro when you're drinking, guess what? You don't need to drink. You also need to check what's going on, that your anger is bubbling under the surface and can come out just because you had 3 or 4 drinks and suddenly you want to kick everybody's tail that's around you. So those are other things that are pretty meaningful as far as alcohol goes. Of course, the impairment of judgment, the impairment of reflexes, drinking and driving, of course, that's not a good idea. Ever, 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 ever. Period. End of story. Alcohol also can have memory disruption. You can have blackout drinking where you have absolutely no memory of what you did, a la the hangover kind of things. You can have the fights that people have. It just makes people more likely to engage in physical aggression. And then, of course, there's the huge problem of sexual problems as far as sexual assaults that happen when people are drinking, rapes that happen when people are drinking. Those kinds of things are very, very problematic aspects of alcohol consumption to the excess. Women process alcohol a little bit differently. We process it slower than men do. So, pound for pound, women process alcohol more slowly than men do. So you get 250-pound people, one's female, one's male. The man's going to get sobered up quicker than the female typically. So that's an additional issue when you're talking about alcohol. So there's just a whole lot of different things that are potentially problematic. There are certainly a lot of people that are alcoholics. There are high functioning alcoholics who can still manage to keep their lives together pretty much. But there's also a lot of people that it becomes just this overpowering aspect of their lives that just messes them up really, really badly. Again, I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, don't do drugs, don't drink, it's all bad. Depends on how you react to it. If you have a first degree relative that's an alcoholic, like a parent or a sibling, or even an uncle, and the second degree relative, be very careful, I would say, because you may have a genetic predisposition that's just going to make you like these things a lot more. Your reward system is just going to go ka-ching, ka-ching. I like this. I want to feel like this for the rest of my life. And it doesn't necessarily even take that much for you to get that biological feedback that's very enjoyable, and then your life goes down the toilet. So there's that. Not to mention hangovers, not pleasant. Puking when you're drunk, not so much fun. That kind of stuff. Other depressants. Depressants are simply drugs that reduce the overall activity of your nervous system. So they slow down your mental processes, they slow down the activity of your nervous system. So alcohol, of course, is one. Barbiturates are the kind of old school tranquilizers. Anything that ends with like barbitol at the end of it. These used to be used as like tranquilizers for people with anxiety back in the mid 20th century, but they are freaking dangerous because they can be overdosed on very easily, like Marilyn Monroe overdosed on barbiturates, among other things. But these drugs are still used, some, but they have largely been replaced by the benzodiazepines because they have roughly the same effect without the danger of overdose. The barbiturates, again, they're just very easy to overdose on, and just for any of these, if you combine central nervous system depressants, the likelihood of you dying is going to be much higher. Mixing barbiturates and alcohol, mixing benzos and alcohol, very, very dangerous. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't know somebody that can pop 2 milligrams of Xanax and chase it down with a glass full of Jose Cuervo, but for most people, it could kill you. You build up a tolerance to stuff because you use all the time. Yeah, you might be able to do that, but there are plenty of people who have lost their lives because they mixed alcohol, and a pretty normal amount of alcohol and a pretty normal amount of a benzo or a barbiturate, and it killed them because it relaxed their central nervous system so much that they died. So just be aware of that. Again, these are medications that can be very useful for people. The benzodiazepines are the main drug type of drugs that are given for people with anxiety disorders. The Xanax, Klonopin, Valium type drugs. These are very good. They work really, really well. But they also do have potential for dependence, and seriously, mixed with alcohol, really, really dangerous stuff. Benzos are actually really hard to overdose on by themselves, but if you mix them with even a very small amount of alcohol, they can be quite dangerous. So that is something just people need to be very aware of if they're taking these medications. And of course, you can get high off of them. Well, with benzos, it's more like you get stoned, you get low. But these are things that have recreational usage as well. So that's another consideration. If you're taking low doses of it to manage your anxiety and you're not taking it every day, you're probably not going to have any problem with it. But if you're taking high doses because you have like panic disorder and you're having to take 2 milligrams several times a day, yeah, you're going to build up a tolerance probably pretty quickly. You could have a dependence issue within a month of that kind of heavy use of it. So again, big difference between like somebody who's taking a 1/4 milligram or 1/2 milligram, when they're flying, versus someone who is needing to take it every day for weeks on end to control their panic attacks. Opiates, of course, are pain-killing medications. These are the things that we get after we have surgery, after we have, nasty dental work that's really invasive, like a root canal. You have opiates that can be given because of, chronic pain disorders, because you were in an accident of some sort. And again, really, really useful drugs, really powerful drugs for pain relief for people. You're talking about opium derivatives like morphine and heroin and Demerol, Vicodin. These are all drugs that work really well for what they do. And of course, they have all kinds of potential for addiction. They have all kinds of potential for abuse. You build up a tolerance to them. The more you take, the more likely you are to overdose on them. And of course, they can kill you. Opiates on their own, there's an epidemic of opiate abuse in the world, and there are lots of places where opiates are too widely available, too easily, and they're a gigantic problem. There's a tremendous amount of legitimate medical use for these drugs, but there's unfortunately also just a lot of abuse that ends up with these dependence issues and addiction issues. And again, opiates also, if you mix them with alcohol, potentially deadly cocktail there. So just something to consider. Doesn't mean don't use them, but just be aware. And if you are someone, again, who has a previous substance abuse issue, if you are someone who has a first degree family member, you just need to be extra careful when you're using these kinds of drugs, because they can just end up wrecking your life, frankly. Stimulants, on the other side of the coin, are drugs that increase the activity of your central nervous system. They increase neural activity in the brain. These are amphetamines. These are methamphetamines. There's caffeine. Caffeine's one. It's a stimulant. It's a relatively mild stimulant, but it's still a stimulant. And one of the things that is just really problematic, there are places where you can get like a cocktail that is a shot of like vodka dropped into a Red Bull. So you're engaging in usage of both a stimulant and a depressant at the same time. And the caffeine and other stuff in a Red Bull will kind of mask the effects of the alcohol, but it still does not undo the fact that you've been drinking alcohol. You're still going to blow, over the limit if you get stopped by the cops and you're driving. It's still going to have the alcohol effects on you, along with the weird kind of counter effects that the caffeine will give. So there are a lot of things that can go along with that can be problematic. Caffeine use in and of itself is not that problematic for most people, but I cannot tell you how many times I had clients come in and they would talk about how they had anxiety, and they would talk about how they had trouble sleeping. And in the long 2-hour intake interview, I would go through and I would ask them questions, and I would find out that they were getting, a gigantic like Route 44 Coke from Sonic after work every night, and they're drinking this massive amount of caffeine, for the next 3 hours, 4 hours. They don't finish it until 9:30 at night, and then they think they're going to go to bed at 10:30 and be able to fall asleep when they just gave themselves like a huge amount of caffeine in their system. Yeah. It's amazing how many people, it's like, switch to something decaffeinated. Yeah, get a Sprite instead of a Coke. You'll probably be able to sleep better within a couple of days. And lo and behold, yeah, several times that was the case. So, caffeinated beverages, generally not going to be that big of a problem, but there are those of us, I am one of them, I cannot handle a lot of caffeine. It makes me jittery and makes me feel, I just don't like it. My husband drinks caffeinated soda all freaking day long, and it's how he functions, but he's got some ADHD issues. It helps him focus. For me, it just makes me feel jittery and gross. So depends on the individual person and how it's going to affect you. Now, on the other hand, amphetamines. Amphetamines are speed. Amphetamines are drugs that are, literally just increase the amount of neural activity you have. These are useful things for a number of different disorders, including ADHD, but also for people who have like narcolepsy, the sleep disorder where you have these uncontrolled sleep attacks. It's also useful for people who have some other disorders. My father-in-law a few years ago had a really bad stroke, and he was being given a low dose of Ritalin to kind of counter some of the effects of that. So, yeah, so there's a lot of legitimate medical reasons for amphetamines to be prescribed to people, but let's face it, there's lots and lots of abuse of amphetamines as well. Now, methamphetamines, there are no good medicinal uses for meth. Meth is a stimulant that is widely available, it's cheap, it's not safe to use at all. It causes all kinds of problems because the vast majority of meth that's out there is cooked by people who do meth. I don't know about you, but the people that I've known that have cooked meth, I wouldn't have trusted them to babysit my pet rock. And they're doing this very complicated, chemistry, and they're using all kinds of nasty chemicals to synthesize the meth, including like industrial floor stripper and paint thinner, rat poison, just all kinds of nasty stuff. So there's cat hair in here, by the way. That's why I'm coughing. I'm not COVID or anything. Just there's a little too much cat hair in here. I cleaned it up in a while. So when you're talking about someone who is using meth, it's usually dirty meth. It's usually going to have nasty leftovers of poisonous things in it, which is a big part of why meth users have like the skin problems, because they're itching, they're scratching because of the impurities in the meth that they're using. It causes like their hair to become very, very rough and nasty. Their skin will get, very blotchy and splotchy, and then they'll have the scratching that they'll scratch and scratch and scratch and cause scarring. Another thing that can happen with meth use is the lovely term called meth mouth, which is basically having your teeth rot along the gum line. Yeah, it'll make you lose your teeth. Straight up. It'll just make you lose your teeth. And I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but your teeth rotting at the gum line means you can't even get crowns, so you have to get implants. And crowns are bloody expensive. I've got quite a few in my mouth. So a crown can cost, I think the last crowns that I got were $800 a piece last summer. Because I got 4 last summer. I had a lot of throwing up when I was pregnant. I'm paying the price for it. My kids are in their 30s now, and I'm still paying for that, literally, in some ways, because I just threw up so much that it messed up my teeth. But it took, a very long time before it really caught up with me seriously. For people who've done meth, it can ruin their teeth within 6 months. We've got a family member who did meth for a while, and and she's got a full mouth of implants that probably cost, a nice new car worth, just for her to be able to have teeth. So things like that go along with it. Not to mention the aging that happens is absolutely remarkable. Not in a good way. If you want to see some really good examples from some mugshots, I think it's in Broward County, Florida. It's Florida. But I think it's called facesofmeth.org. If you want to see pictures of people who've been on meth, it shows like mugshots of somebody 6 months apart or something, and it's like, oh my goodness, it is remarkable how much people can age. I remember, years back, I had a client that I was working with, a kid that I was working with, and his mom had gotten out of rehab after having done her jail time. And she was clean, and she'd been clean for like 6 months. And I had been told I had a client waiting for me out in the lobby of the place I was working. And I went out and I looked around and I was like, no. And I went back to my office, and then the secretary called and was like, Rebecca, your client's here. And I'm like, well, what? Nobody's out there. She's like, no, it's that lady. This is a 32-year-old woman. And I swear to y'all, she looked like she was 60, and not a well-preserved 60 either. I was gobsmacked. I could not believe that this woman was only 32 years old. I mean, I am in my mid-50s, and I don't have anywhere near the kind of wrinkles and skin problems and stuff that this poor woman had at 32 years old. My kids are both older than that. My kids are in their mid-30s, and they don't either one have any wrinkles on their face at all. And this poor girl was covered in wrinkles and splotches, and her hair was and her teeth were messed up. Honestly, she looked like a rode hard, put up wet 60-year-old. And she was 32. And she'd only been doing meth for like a year. I mean, that's a long time to do meth, but still, it can really wreak havoc on people. Of course, there's also cocaine as a stimulant. And, I figure y'all probably are aware of that already and some of the details of that. But cocaine is just it comes from a coca plant. And that doesn't mean it's an all natural substance. It's not good for you, but cocaine is snorted generally. It does have some medicinal uses. There are a few eye, ear, nose, and throat procedures, eye surgeries, things like that, that can use cocaine drops and things to numb the area. Cocaine gives you a fairly short but very intense high. Generally, if you snort cocaine, you're going to only be high maybe, an hour at the most. Crack cocaine, of course, is, kind of like boiled down essence of cocaine that gives you a high that's extremely powerful but only lasts about 5 minutes. It burns through all the dopamine in your brain, so all the feel-good chemicals in your brain just get torched. So you come down from it and then you feel terrible. So that's one of the bigger problems with cocaine is that, you have this really great high while it lasts, but afterward you pay for it. You feel like dog crap. And ecstasy does a bit of that too. Ecstasy or MDMA, I wrote this out here. Methylene dioxymethamphetamine is ecstasy. Ecstasy kind of goes in several categories because it also has some mild hallucinogenic effects. Ecstasy makes you feel really good, makes you feel euphoric. Again, it also burns through a lot of dopamine very quickly in your body, and it takes days for it to build back up after you use it because ecstasy highs last for hours. And it makes people feel euphoric. It makes them feel very affectionate. It's kind of jokingly called a hug drug. It makes people feel good while they're on it, hence the name ecstasy. But one of the more dangerous things about ecstasy is that it can deregulate your body's ability to control its temperature. So your body temperature gauge kind of goes haywire. And there was a time in the early 2000s, especially, where these like big parties they were called raves, that were really popular, and they'd be held in like warehouses that didn't have air conditioning. It'd be super hot because there's all these bodies in there bouncing around dancing, and all these kids would be on ecstasy and they wouldn't be hydrated enough, and it's really hot, and their body temperature mechanisms just go offline, and some of these kids would just fall over because their body temperature was like 105, 106. They basically just cooked from the inside and had brain damage, or they would die from it. So that is a pretty significant problem with ecstasy. It's certainly not, as potentially dangerous as some of this other stuff immediately. Like, you take enough cocaine, it can just cause you to have a heart attack and die. Bam. If you take a whole bunch of it very quickly. But again, all things, you can take enough aspirin to, make you die. So there's all kinds of stuff. Not that I'm saying there's a good amount of cocaine to use, God, but there are lots and lots of things that can have a negative effect with a fairly small dosage. Ecstasy's one of those things that's like, my kids were friends with this kid that came to my house once, and I had a rule in my house is like, do not come over here drunk or hide. I don't want your parents thinking that I'm cool with that, because I'm not. But our house was one that our kids' friends, used to hang out because we were young parents and whatever. I mean, when my kids were in high school, I was only in my mid-30s, and one of their friends came over and he was on ecstasy, and I'm just like, oh, dude. And I was pissed at him because I was just like, oh, would you stop doing all this stuff? You're going to end up killing yourself. He didn't. He's doing well now, but there were a few years there we were really worried about him. But I let him in the house because I'd never seen anybody on ecstasy before. So he comes in and, we're watching him. The first thing I did was go and get him a big old bottle of Gatorade, one of those quart bottles of Gatorade, and handed it to him. And he's, drinking that down. And he had just got an iPod for his birthday. And just to give you an idea how long ago this was when they still had the scroll wheels on them on the front. So, yeah, we're talking ancient history here, like early 2000s. It actually probably was around 2003. So it was a long time ago. And I was just watching him, but we had a cat that was super affectionate, and the cat got up in his lap, and he's petting this cat, and his eyes are basically just rolling back in his head because your sensory input gets very heightened when you're on ecstasy. And he was petting that cat, and it was getting a little gross. I mean, not like sexual gross, but just disconcerting. kind of thing. And my younger son, who's in his grade, went and just grabbed the cat and went, dude, no, not cool. But I was just watching this kid, and I saw him 2 days later at school, and I was just like, hey, and I was yelling down the hall at him, and he's just like, yeah, just flinching at every bit of sound, everything. So of course I get right up in his face, and I'm just like practically yelling in his face, going, "Hey, how are you doing?" Not so good. It took him 3 solid days to feel back to normal after doing that ecstasy. And I remember very, solidly just straight up asking this guy, so was it worth it? I don't know, maybe. Because he felt really good for about 4 hours, but he felt like absolute crap for over 3 days afterwards. I don't know about you. That doesn't sound like a good trade off to me. But again, people gonna do stuff. Ecstasy also has some mild hallucinogenic qualities. Hallucinogens, of course, are drugs that are, well, their main intention is for you to be hallucinating from them, to see things, hear things, smell things, taste things, feel things that aren't actually happening. LSD, of course, is probably the most famous, lysergic acid diethylmide. That's been around since the 1940s, but it got really popular in the 60s and 70s. There's also other hallucinogens. You've got like psilocybin mushrooms, you've got mescaline. There's other stuff that you can hallucinate from. THC, of course, is tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the main active ingredient in marijuana. Marijuana also can have some mild hallucinogenic effects, but marijuana is one of those things that has so many different effects depending on what strain, what type of marijuana you're talking about, that the hallucinogenic quality is not usually the main thing that people are after when they smoke pot. You can have pot that has more kind of pain relief qualities. You can have pot that has more anxiety relief qualities. You can have pot that will even make you paranoid. Not that that's usually a desired effect of it. There's the appetite stimulant qualities of it, which can actually be very useful when you're talking about people who have that are going through chemotherapy or something like that. There are legitimate medicinal uses for marijuana. It is medicinally prescribed. You can actually get a weed card where you can have legal weed. There's a dispensary in Caddo Valley, just a few miles down the road here. So, again, there are legitimate medical uses for some of these things. LSD, there are some very interesting studies that are being done right now on using LSD as a treatment for PTSD. So there's that, but that is not like someone taking, hits of acid recreationally and then, watching cartoons or something. That's not what it's being used for medicinally. But again, you don't have habitual abuse of hallucinogenic drugs the way you do of the stimulants and depressants typically. So there's that. All right, well, that's the end of that. For the next lecture, which will be on Tuesday, you've got your assignment in Canvas for this week, so please make sure that gets done. And for next week, we will be hitting, I think it's the last stuff before we get into the developmental stuff. So we'll be talking about that on Tuesday. And y'all have a good long weekend. Please stay safe, and y'all take care, and we'll see you next week.